Moving into Mary Shelley's novel, we need to kind of take stock of Victor Frankenstein, the character from whom the novel takes its title. So we'll look at some aspects of Victor Frankenstein as a character here. A few things that mark him in the novel. Number one, he is a maker. Maybe you could use the word creator here as well. And as such, he kind of has this certain pride of knowing, this hubris of knowing. And so we can think about how, as a character, he is unwound by that sense of pride or of knowing here. A tension in this is that you could read him as a father as well. In what ways do you see his relationship with the creature as father and child? So that's a tension that rests within him as a character. We can also read other points of conflict within the novel. Victor has various kind of points of conflict within his family, within his field of study, and those other points of conflict that are buried deeper within him. His kind of sense of self as he moves through the world here. And one other tension with him as a character is your sense of his reliability. Is he a reliable teller of his own story here? How do points of obsession start to contort or reframe him as a character as the novel develops? First, Victor is a maker. Victor himself is driven by study. He says of himself that he can make application of longer endurance. That's right. He can stay in the lab for long periods of time. So he develops kind of this obsessive focus, first on natural philosophy, where he's reading works that are outdated in the end. And he comes to Ingolstadt to study as a university student and is drawn to the lab there. And there he says, chemistry became my sole occupation. He calls it his secret toil, which brings him horror in the end, as he is continuously in the lab working and trying to discover the roots of life. As such, Victor, is a creator, and he seeks to find the causes and effects of life, oftentimes without thinking about how his research impacts others or how it impacts himself at points. So there's a certain kind of pride or hubris that drives him here and drives his research, and that's a tension within him as a character, and has a tension within the novel as well. How does scientific inquiry kind of create that sense of pride and knowing in the end? Victor seeks to create a being much like himself, or tries to develop a new species, and this drives him on. And that central question that drives him here is, whence did the principle of life proceed? He's looking for the cause, right? The roots or the cause of life. And so within this kind of telling, do you read Victor as a maker or creator, or is it possible to still read him as a father here? So there's tension in how you read these things, whether you see him as just simply a maker, or you see him as more kind of organically as father here. Is there a point where Victor crosses a boundary in this novel? As he looks for those origins of life. There's this moment in chapter 4 where he relates, "Whence I often ask myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has ever been considered as a mystery. Yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries? I revolved these circumstances in my mind. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which from being the seat of beauty and strength had become food for the worm. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman." So think about the boundaries that Victor crosses in this passage from chapter 4. Does he cross a boundary when he starts to ask that question, look for the origins of life, as he looks for the basic causes of life. Does he cross a boundary when he starts to, take a recourse to death, as he says here, right? Where he starts, to study the human body in a distinct kind of focus here, where he is willing to gather bodies, dead bodies for, at any cost to propel his experiment forward. Does he cross a boundary when he starts to look at these dead bodies, in a certain way where they are no longer, where they become, less about being, former human lives, where they become, just tools for his experiment in the end? Or does he cross a boundary when he starts to lose sight of the fact that this drive, has a certain kind of pride or hubris behind it, that that the drive forces him into a kind of madness and obsession with knowing? Where does he cross the boundary here in the end, right? As he extends his experiments. There are other points of conflict within the novel we can also think about. This sense of Victor's origins himself within the family. He's born in Geneva. He's defined by his father's wealth. He has certain grief when his mother dies, and you could ask that question: does he ever kind of come to terms with his mother's absence and death? He creates a motherless creature on his own. In what ways is he able to understand the creature's motherlessness through his own loss of his mother, or not? He's engaged to marry his cousin Elizabeth, and so his relationship with her throughout the novel kind of calls him back to sanity at points, and at other points it kind of drives him away from family, into a deeper sense of disconnection. Within his field of study, he also kind of feels conflict, that he kind of works against nature in some ways. When he comes to Ingolstadt, an instructor asks him, have you really spent your time studying such nonsense? When Victor is reading these kind of outdated texts in natural philosophy, as opposed to kind of modern scientific laboratory studies. So he gets called into the lab by being called out of some of these older conceptions of how science works, these outdated or archaic conceptions of science. And he starts to see the lab, though, in his own way, where he sees it as a workshop of his filthy creation. So Victor's kind of feeling a sense of isolation as he develops his laboratory skills. And that kind of feeds, in a sense, the ways in which he treats the creature when the creature appears within the novel here. That Victor, in his isolated condition, feels kind of a lack of empathy for the creature. As he speaks about the creation itself, he says he feels a bitterness of disappointment when he actually sees the creature in the end, and so he runs from it, he escapes from it. I sought to avoid the wretch, a frightful fiend, he says. So rather than embracing this creation of his, rather embracing this child of his, he runs from that. He runs from that creature, and seeks to avoid it in all his travels. There's kind of an obsessive focus that defines Victor in this regard. It feeds his study, right? Kind of gives him a skewed version of the natural world. He sees the world as a secret, which he desires to discover. So it's, he, from the very beginning, he's driven in his studies. But there are also kind of day-to-day, ordinary, obsessive inward drives that define Victor's focus here. And he cuts himself off from others. He isolates himself from others. And note how this is very different from his friend Clerval's empathy, that Clerval is always kind of able to call him back to himself. But Victor can't quite escape that isolation. He has confidence overcome by gloom. He has a frantic impulse with his work. He has an irresistible hold with his imagination, and when he gets to the point of seeing the creature, he defines the creature as his enemy here. Note how this obsessive focus kind of goes into the way he tells his own story here in the novel, right? That we can look at Walton's growing horror as he hears Victor's tale, or is there a point as Victor tells his own story where you as a reader start to feel that Victor is less reliable than you'd hope in the ways in which he tells his story? One moment in this is a moment where he tells the story of the creation of the creature here. Victor says, "How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set. His shriveled complexion and straight black lips. I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps, as if I sought to avoid the wretch, whom I feared every turning of the street would present to my view. I did not dare return to the apartment." So he abandons the creature here, right? He looks at the creature and the creature's watery eyes and escapes from the creature, leaves the child behind. At what point do you feel Victor crossing a boundary here as he seeks to escape from his creation? All this seems to reveal an incapacity for empathy in Victor as a character. That he's unable to identify with the creature, with the creature's own loneliness and isolation. And Victor kind of retreats into his own, into himself, and cuts himself off further from the world, and finds isolation there, to a point where Victor will say, "I bore a hell within me."